Well, there is one thing I wanted to cover on this, and this is the fact that, and again, I touched on a little bit earlier on when I was talking about, if we are trying to build a more comprehensive plan of action, like having maintenance periods, one of the things that you can do throughout, whether you decide to go for a fat loss phase or not, is to focus on health outcomes or health habits, I suppose is a better way of thinking of this, in terms of like what things are you going to do day to day that are actually going to set you up for better health in the future, and they're also going to set you up for an easier transition to a more maintainable diet rather than being in a deficit. It's like, are we eating protein throughout the day? Are we working on like a sleep, stress management, all those other stuff that we've talked about before a million times? Like, are we actually doing that in a day-to-day context? Are we actually setting ourselves up for success long term? Or are we just prioritizing purely fat loss in the moment, right? Because that small little change in the mindset, it actually has huge ramifications down the line in terms of actually achieving what you want to achieve and actually being in the position that you want to be in, for the rest of your life, right? And I kind of want to just end this on top of that, unless you have anything to add to that.
Oh.
Fantastic. One question that I do ask a lot of people when they are looking for fat loss, when they are really focusing on this stuff, because it happens, like Gary said, like once you've seen a certain level of body fatness, like all the other levels above that, like all the percentages above that, you're kind of like, oh, like that, I'm not as lean as I once was or whatever, right? And then also from the outside looking in, you might be like, oh man, I would definitely be happier if I had, veins running through my abs or whatever else, right? Like, two questions that I actually, again, I ask quite a lot are like, will losing fat right now actually make you love yourself more? Right. And that sounds a bit wishy-washy in terms of like, oh, I love myself or whatever else. But like realistically, no one else is going to love you unless you love yourself. Right? So like that's the foundation. And if you think having this hyper focus of hatred towards your body somehow, is going to make you love yourself more. If you're looking at your body going like, you are fucking disgusting, you've got fat here, and like that's the self-talk you have. It's like, that's not going to lead to a good position. That's not going to lead to an outcome where you actually end up loving yourself more, like, and yeah, well, you might be like, oh, well, if I got rid of this body fat right here, then I would actually be allowed to love myself. Then I would actually be able to love myself. I can tell you right now, that's very rarely the case. Like I can think of about fucking 200 clients that I've had just off the top of my head where we've gotten to a level of body fatness where they're like, oh yeah, once I just get to the next point here, or once I just lose this small bit of fat here, or, it's like, then I'll be able to I'll be happy with this. And I'm like, you have been saying this for the last 10%, the last 2 months, you've been going like, oh yeah, when I hit this next milestone, I'll allow myself to be happy. Or when I hit this next one, then I'll allow myself to be happy. I'm like, stop moving the goalpost. Like, you are either allowed to be happy regardless of what you look like, or you're just always going to be chasing this imaginary point, and a lot of people fall into that trap of chasing this imaginary point. And in reality, it's just because they don't want to be happy. Like they actually don't want to be happy. They're happy being unhappy, right? And that's something that we actually need to work on. And rather than just like, obviously I'm being a little bit hyperbolic when I say that, but it is something that needs to be actually addressed. It's a psychological issue. It's not a physiological or physical issue. It's like, these people actually want to hate their body, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be like, deep-rooted fucking trauma in their past where it's like they actually feel like they're not worth anything. So when they actually achieve their goals, they're like, you know what, that wasn't good enough, wasn't quite good enough. Even though I achieved exactly what I set out to achieve, I'm going to say that wasn't good enough. And you're like, why was it not good enough? But that is a question to ask yourself. Like, will losing actually make you love yourself more? Right? Like, will losing that body fat actually make you love yourself more? You might not know the answer to that question. If you've never been lean, you might be like, I don't know, maybe. But a lot of people have gotten to a level of leanness that is leaner than the position they are right now. And you need to think to yourself, like, did I love myself more at that level of leanness? And unless the answer to that question is a resounding yes, it actually made me love myself, 10 times more, 20 times more when I was 5 kilos leaner, then we need to reassess whether or not, we're doing this for the right reasons. Like, if you're like, all right, I know actually I feel far better in myself, I look, feel, perform, etc., when I'm 5 kilos lighter and I just want to, get back to that level. Going into that fat loss phase, I could be like, all right, we're actually, fairly well in a good position. Whereas if you're like, yeah, I used to be actually 10 kilos lighter, fucking hated myself then. I'm like, okay, well, like we're not actually going to get a better loving environment just by losing fat, if like we already know, like, okay, you've lost 10 or you've gained 10 kilos. And if we were to lose those 10 kilos again, you don't necessarily love yourself anymore. It's like, we need to address that, right? And then also a further question that I ask to this is like, will losing fat significantly improve your life right now? For some people, obviously that's a resounding yes. Like if you're like, oh, I have health implications or health issues that, losing body fat right now is actually going to improve them, then obviously that's a resounding yes. But if you're just your general Joe Soap or whatever, and you're like, oh, will losing body fat improve my life? Like that's something that you need to think about. You actually need to sit back and be like, okay, say I do lose 5 kilos, 10 kilos, 20 kilos, whatever it is. Like, how is that actually going to improve your life, right? Just the fat loss aspect. Don't focus on the health habits. Don't focus on anything else. Like, obviously we know that they're going to improve your life. You're going to have more energy. You're going to feel great, blah, 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 just by engaging in exercise and, eating well. But why does that have to be in a calorie deficit, right? Like, why do we actually have to lose the fat? Like for some individuals, for sure, you're going to feel better. You're actually going to improve your life by losing body fat. But for a lot of individuals, what they actually need is just an improvement in their overall diet, an improvement in their sleep, an improvement in their training, an improvement in all these other aspects. And it's not necessarily fat loss that they need, right? So that is something to be aware of. Like, you need to ask those two questions. Like, will fat loss actually make you love yourself more? And then will fat loss actually improve your life right now? What are your thoughts there, Gary? And don't give me a simple one-word answer, because I could see you were nodding off right there. You were about to snooze. You were like, I need some absolute fire to finish this podcast up.
I'm sure the listeners are about to snooze as well. No, like, I mean, I basically said it already. Look, fat loss is not guaranteed to improve your life. Yes, there's a high probability that any person sampled in the population is probably going to improve their health by losing a bit of body fat. They'll probably perceive themselves to look a little bit better, but that's not the case for everyone. And that's particularly the case in the sample that we have a biased selection of here, which is a fit cohort of people. Like most people who listen to this podcast are probably already in the gym, managing their diet in some way. You're probably in decent shape compared to most of the population, and for that reason, it's not a guarantee, and it's definitely lower probability than the average person in the population that you'll improve your health or improve your perceived well-being by moving forward with fat loss and getting significantly leaner. So you have to ask yourself those questions. Is this going to improve my quality of life? Is it going to improve my sense of self-worth or self-esteem or self-efficacy or whatever? And the answer to that isn't always yes. So you have to ask the question.
Fantastic. Anyway, that kind of wraps up that podcast. Obviously, this is a bit more of a higher level, I suppose, podcast. And not that it's like, higher level thinking is required, but it is one of those things where you kind of have to step back from being in the thick of it, because I know so many people, like the two of us have definitely both been in this position where you're just like, oh yeah, like body composition, that's what we focus on. We want to get shredded, get fucking, jacked and whatever else. And you're just very much in the moment of that. Or even like, other times you're gonna be like, oh, very much like focused on health and very much, whatever. When in reality, it's like, we actually need to be able to step back and actually assess critically what are the merits of this intervention. Because, and we've said it before, it's like a fat loss intervention is not without risk. Like there is the possibility of risk with a fat loss intervention, whether that's a health risk in terms of, physiological health risk or a psychological health risk. Like they're both present, and also we have to look at it from the perspective, especially the two of us are coaches, and like we are trying to help people achieve their goals. And one part of that is actually setting goals. It's actually being clear on what the goal is. And you have to very often with coaching help an individual be clear on their goals, because they don't actually know what they want. They have a very vague idea of what they want, and you have to help them set more clear and tangible goals within that. And if you're not able to take a step back, you're just going to end up advocating for fat loss for everyone. You're just going to be like, oh yeah, well, fat loss is clearly, associated with better health outcomes, so let's lose fat. When in reality, you should have more appropriately screened this individual and realized that their goals doesn't, like, they don't require fat loss. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe some small amount of fat loss would help them, but they actually care more about performance. They actually care more about just building something sustainable for the rest of their life. They want to know how to manage social occasions. They want to get rid of this like food anxiety, this food guilt, and different things like that. And it has actually nothing to do with fat loss. So like, don't end up as a coach trying to always fit a square peg into a round hole. You actually need to help the client. Like, that's what they're coming to you for.